each try to just have a conversation with the people in their circle, with 3 different people, about whether Trump was too racially problematic to elect. Not trying to preach at them, just raising the question, we might have a different result. If they were successful 1/3 of the time, we have a different result. So I started this project because I recognized that white people who think racism is real, who think that Trump's nature might be too problematic to elect, did not know how to have effective conversations with the people in their circle. That's why this project started, and I think that is still true. Maybe things have gotten worse. My goal is to try to shift how white progressives think about relating to Trump, and moreover, Trump supporters, so that people can have a productive conversation. Now, there's some good news in all of that. One piece of good news, I just saw this the other day. One piece of good news is that because of the recent protests and raised consciousness, 49% of white people, white Republicans, think that race relations is an important issue within the election. 49%. So I would advise you to think about that and to perhaps even integrate that into your conversation. If half of Republicans, if half of white Republicans think this is an important issue, it's not surprising given what we're going through. But you might want to find out, is the person I'm talking to part of that 49%? If they're not, you don't talk about that. But if they are, maybe you want to pursue that. That's different than going into the conversation, you know you're going to talk about race, you know you're going to talk about how he's racially problematic. That might not be an important thing for that person, and thus that might not be a good strategy for you. So what we need to teach people how to do is to be strategic as they try to approach these kind of conversations. So I'm going to be teaching a course starting in a couple of weeks. On June 14th, I believe, is the starting date. It's sponsored by the Unitarian Church. It's called UU's Find Your Voice, but it's not just for UU's. The voice stands for Values Organized to Instigate Compassionate Engagement. I love acronyms. And the point is, we want to teach people how to use best practices in persuasion. There'll be 2 tracks to the course. One of the tracks is going to be on persuading people to vote progressive, and the one of it is going to be on persuading people to vote at all. So now, and before the end of the chat, Alana's doing it now, you can see a sign-up list for that. It'll like everything else, it'll have it on Zoom. And I'm grateful that that 2 UU churches, one in Portland, one in Washington, decided that we want to do this and make it available to people. And the goal is to do this course online, shoot it on video, so that then after that we can make it available as a completely asynchronous engagement strategy that doesn't even need me, but is more available online. But we need the initial group in order to make that happen. So I would encourage you to think about that if you want to perfect your skills on that. Okay. So, as I said, white people got 2 jobs. People only got 1 job. It's nice that we got more jobs this time. But there's some things that we need to know about each of those strategies of trying to be persuasive. And we'll talk about more of this in the course, but there's a couple of things just to let you know. There's been some decent research on what to do to get people to vote who are not inclined to vote. One of them is just registration. There's a big correlation between just people going through the process of registering and actually voting. So if you have people in your circle who don't vote and who are not registered, simply the act of supporting them to get registered or nudging them lovingly to get registered can be helpful. A second thing is helping them. A lot of people don't vote because they don't have a plan. The logistics seem too difficult. So part of what we know is the best practice in getting people to vote is to just talk through, how are you going to do that? Are you going to catch the bus, or how are you going to meld it with your job, or whatever that is? So even just going through that is helpful. Lastly, and again, all of this we'll talk about more in the course, is as you try to talk about them voting, make it more of an identity issue. Like, you're the kind of person who votes, right? You're the kind of person who cares about America and who votes. So don't make it an action, make an identity issue. And one of the things we know is that kind of shift in the frame is more effective in persuading people. Okay. But let's shift to the specific job that white folks have, which is persuadable Trump supporters. The most important thing, and I hope I've said it already, the most important thing to do that y'all ain't doing is to shift your mindset to a stance of compassion instead of condescension and othering. If you're talking to somebody who votes, who might be leaning or might be inclined to vote for Trump, that shift is a critical factor in persuasion about almost anything in a peer-to-peer setting. You can be demeaning and condescending to children as you try to persuade them because they need to do what you want anyway. But if you're trying to relate to peer-to-peer, what's vital is that people feel that you're coming from a place of compassion, that you're empathetically listening, that you want to hear what they have to say, and that you're not looking down on them. And so making that shift is critical. We teach a method in the course is not about race called the REACH method, which for those of you who are familiar with this project, in the White Ally work that's focused on racial issues, we call it the RACE method. Same method we call in the non-race issue, we call it the REACH method. Reflect, inquire, English spelling, ask, coax, and honor. So essentially the idea is you calm yourself down, reflect, you ask questions to see where they're coming from, you try to find a point of agreement, and you then, after all of that, you then try to coax them to your position, and then you make sure you honor them, make you feel they feel honored, and that they can hold on to what you've agreed with and this new idea. That's the core method that we'll be teaching more about. Okay. I would say that that's a couple more things I want to add before we take some questions. If you're trying to deal with a Trump supporter, a persuadable Trump supporter, there's some important things that you want to do and not do. So, one of the things that you need to make a decision about is, and I would suggest a certain way of deciding it, is that I would not suggest that you go wholesale at their conservative approach to the world. This election is too important. We have time to try to come to some different resolution about conservatism in the world. I think that Mr. Trump has enough weaknesses, and this election is too important, and going at people's ideology is too difficult, that you are better off going at their feelings for this guy as opposed to the fact that they have a conservative orientation. In the course, we will talk about the whole conservative versus liberal mindsets. It's important to think about that. There's a whole body of literature popularized mostly by Jonathan Haidt from The Righteous Mind, a fantastic scholar and thinker, but he's not the only person to talk about moral frameworks theory. But I think that we need to cultivate the way to strategically use that, what we know about the different way that conservatives and liberals think about themselves, and to let that infuse our conversation. So that's important. That's an important thing to think about. But I am suggesting that you not try to go at their conservatism, because that's a big hill to try to climb. I would say that while I love people having a extensive racial analysis, and I certainly teach that part of the task of being an ally is to try to slowly move people toward a higher racial analysis, I would advise that people be careful about taking that on as they try to engage Mr. Trump. Just be careful about that. If you're talking to somebody who, like, race is important to them, I think it's important to think through how much do you want to try to use this moment of trying to expand the crack in his support to get them to understand structural racism? I'm not sure that that's a strategic move. If you're trying to, again, if you know somebody is worried about race relations in the presidency, I'm not sure that pursuing that is the best time to do some additional work, which is to try to upgrade their overall racial analysis. There are some things that we know about Mr. Trump's, his weaknesses that might be a stretch to think about and to execute, but are useful. So it goes back to moral framework theory. So one of the things that tends to be really important by conservative people and less important by progressive people is the issue of loyalty. There's certainly many examples of Mr. Trump being disloyal, especially the military. We're seeing one this week, right? This whole thing of just not caring that much, that there's a bounty on soldiers. I think that is a sign of disloyalty. The way he talked about John McCain as, I don't want to, I like people who weren't caught. His treatment of the Khans, the Gold Star, the Gold Star family. He has done multiple things that suggest a certain level of disloyalty to the military. Now, as a progressive, you probably don't like the military that much, and you're not that much into loyalty, but you're trying to be persuasive. So what I'm suggesting you think about, if you're talking to somebody and they're Trump persuadable, is going at the question of, I worry that he's just not sufficiently loyal to the military like we need presidents to be. What do you think about that? So here, this is what I'm trying to convey, is that we need to shift our approach toward conversation. You wouldn't do that to somebody who is progressive because they might also have a similar fundamental questions about the military, much less about loyalty. What this is about, what persuasion is about, is not talking about things from your point of view, but talking in ways that reflect their point of view and to try to move them forward. Another technique that I want to suggest to you is something called motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is a strategy for managing an interaction that comes out of the social work profession and attempts to try to get people to deal with their addiction. I'll give you the really quickie version of that. So imagine that you have somebody who is they're addicted to some substance. They like it. It's the old, I'm not addicted to cocaine, I just like it, right? So they know they have an addiction, but they're not ready to give it up yet. But deep down, they know that it's causing them a problem. So what a counselor might do is to say, how much do you like, on a scale of positive 10, negative 10, tell me how much you like your cocaine consumption patterns right now. Everybody say, well, I like him at an 8. Okay, why? Here and why. How come it's not a 10? And the point of that is to try to get them to get in touch with the smaller part of themselves that's the part you want to emphasize. And so once they talk about why it's not a 10, they might talk about the way that it's taking all their money, or it's keeping them estranged from their family, or whatever that is. Then that gives you some clues, some insight as to what to pursue. So in a similar situation here, you might ask a similar question about the support of Trump. If support of Trump is a 10, and support of Biden is a negative 10, where are you? They say they're a 7, and you give them room to talk about why that is, and then you ask them why, how come it's not a 10? And then you can connect with, you can focus their attention on the part of themselves that is ambivalent. And your goal, conversationally, is to try to grow that, try to nurture that, try to get them to focus on that. That technique is called motivational interviewing. Okay. The couple things to not do. Something like this happened to me yesterday, and that is not be distracted by things that are designed to bait you into other conversations. So I was on a podcast yesterday with this guy who was a conservative. My first time doing that, and we were talking about liberals and conservatives, And he basically put up the idea that, well, if all these problems were caused, the systemic, we talk about systemic racism, he said, well, Obama didn't do anything about it. He wanted me to get into a conversation where I'm debating about Obama. And I was like, well, I didn't say that Obama was perfect, right? Then he tried it again, no later. I was talking about the how people were taught bias, and he said, well, you learn bias from education and the media, and all of these are controlled by liberals. So basically try to get me to argue about whether liberals are producing the bias anyway. I was like, well, they are, maybe they are. They also wanted to get me to argue about whether they're controlled, whether these are overly influenced by liberals. I'm not taking that bait, right? In this case, one of the things you have to think about if you're trying to persuade somebody is they, even if you start making progress, then their resistance might come out and try to have you have an argument about Hillary or an argument about Obama. And I would suggest that you try to resist the temptation to get into that. As much as you might have liked Obama or Hillary, that becomes a distraction to your point. Something similar. One of the things that they're trying to do, that Mr. Trump, the campaign is trying to do, is to try to portray Mr. Biden as diminished. I mean, he is the oldest candidate running. And more importantly, I think he is diminished. So is Trump. So one of the things that is important to do if you're really trying to be persuasive is to not be reflexively defensive of your position. Yeah, Joe Biden ain't who he used to. He ain't who he was 4 years ago. He ain't who he was 8 years ago. He certainly ain't what he was 16 years ago when he was, or 12 years ago when he was running against Obama. He isn't that. But we can see the difference in 4 years. Mr. Trump ain't who he was either. But that's not the main point. The point is, yes, he's not who he was. That's why he had vice presidents, and he ain't that bad anyway, right? He is not who he was, but he's capable of doing the job. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because you, as the person's resistance to whatever progress you're making comes up, they will put other things in your way to try to distract you so they can revert back to their basic position. And I'm suggesting don't take the bait. And you can do that if you are trying to approach the conversation from a place of center and strategically. So I have more things to say, but we're coming up time, and I want to give time for questions. So I would say the most important thing is if you're really going to try to engage people across this divide, the most important thing is to figure out a way to gin up your compassion. We sometimes teach people to imagine your conversation partner that you are not liking what they say. Imagine them as a 5-year-old taking a bath. Like to think of them in some vulnerable situation that would draws upon your heart, so you're not in attack mode. I almost had y'all do that today, but I decided not to do that, right? I almost showed y'all a picture of 5-year-old Donald Trump and had y'all think about that. But as you're thinking about who you want to engage, you might want to do a mental exercise, not necessarily about Donald Trump, but about the person you're talking to try to gin up your compassion, because that is such a important part of your being persuasive. Final thing before I take some questions is there are people who are having bias remorse about Donald Trump. We don't need to make them grovel, right? If somebody's expressing you bias remorse about Donald Trump, you don't need to, well, what's wrong with you? I saw that a long time ago. That is not helping you close the deal. We don't want to operate as a culture where people are disincentivized to admit, maybe he ain't who I thought he was. And my concern is that the way our rhetoric on the left goes, we're not remembering that these are human beings who might come to the conclusion they made a mistake, and our job is to draw them in, not make them feel like idiots because they didn't see what we saw. So, it's 10 to the hour, and I want to take questions if there are any.